Yes, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Katagalan Forum. And now we will proceed to the panel discussion 3, titled International Supply Chain Restructuring and Taiwan's Role Concerning Economic Security. There are 5 panelists in this session, respectively from Canada, Belgium, the Netherlands, Korea, and the Republic of China, Taiwan. And now, please welcome the moderator of panel discussion 3, Professor Xia-Ru Shirley Lin, Chair of Center for Asia-Pacific Resilience and Innovation of Republic of China, Taiwan. Welcome.
Thank you, everybody. For those of you who have the resilience and endurance to stay until this panel, we welcome you, especially for so many of our guests who are here for the first time. Welcome to Taiwan. So I am now pleased to moderate this excellent panel on an important topic, following 2 other excellent panels today that you've heard focusing on security and also gray zone tactics against democracy. As a professor at the University of Virginia and also at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and non-resident senior fellow at Brookings, I shuttle between Washington, Hong Kong, and Taipei and welcome this amazing opportunity after so many years of virtual discussions between cities. Our speakers are diplomats, experts, scholars from Canada, Europe, South Korea, and Taiwan. While the earlier discussions focused primarily on security and geopolitics, we will now hone in on the economic dimension of security, and specifically global supply chain. Since the beginning of the US-China trade war, countries and corporations have been under great pressure to diversify their supply chain. And of course, the supply chain disruptions caused by COVID-19 further accelerated the restructuring of the supply chains. Taiwan's remarkable achievement in the semiconductor industry is a source of pride for the country and an envy to others. However, it has ironically become a double-edged sword, testing Taiwan's resolve to become a source of resilience for the world rather than a problem. I hope that we can draw inspiration from the panelists' insights to understand Taiwan's central role in order to better navigate the uncertainty of the global supply chain and enhance global and regional resilience. So I understand from the organizers that everyone is usually quite tired by now. And so in order to give all of our panelists an opportunity to not only provide insight, but to have a more dynamic exchange, we like to mix it up a bit, if you will. So this panel will consist of a series of questions that I like to ask them. Hopefully our panelists are also in agreement with this new format. So I have a couple of questions for all of them, and we will introduce each panelist as we ask the first question. So there will be an opportunity, very importantly, at the end for question and answers for 20 minutes. So please hold your questions until then, and we look forward to that exchange. My first questions to all of our panelists is, how would you describe recent trends in international supply chain restructuring? It sounds like a common question. In Taiwan, almost everyone I know can answer that question, even taxi drivers. And I think that it's a wonderful thing to have different perspectives on this question from different parts of the world, but more importantly, from different expertise. And what are the most important implications for your country or organization? I'd like to start by introducing the Vice Chair of the Canadian Committee on Pacific Economic Cooperation, which I've been involved with for the last 6 years from Hong Kong as well. And he is also the former Canadian representative in Taiwan and studied Chinese at my university, the Chinese University of Hong Kong. So, 欢迎, and can we start with you? 3 minutes for each of you, please.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lin. Fortunately, I talked to my taxi driver yesterday, so I have some ideas to be able to share. So trends and implications. Well, I guess obviously the first trend is the whole issue of vulnerability of supply chains, which was evident even before COVID, but became particularly apparent because of COVID. I think three dimensions, certainly from a Canadian perspective. The first was suddenly we found that supply chains were extremely vulnerable because of limited sources of supply. This initially related to PPE and medical equipment and so on. But that was one factor, that the materials were just not available. That was compounded by the experience of choke points. I guess I'll talk specifically about China, the way China dealt in some ways successfully with COVID, but there was collateral damage. And so we know about the disruptions and interruptions in Chinese ports, and China has 8 of the 10 largest ports. So the supply chains were governed by whatever actions the Chinese government was taking. It impacted labor. But it wasn't just, the choke points weren't just in Chinese ports. From a Canadian perspective, there was the Canada-US border, across which travels more bilateral trade every day than any other trading relationship. And so you could just imagine the issues initially in the early stages of COVID, the interruptions, the ability for truckers to cross the border, the documentation, and so forth. And the third element of disruption of supply chains coming out of COVID were various political responses. Some countries slapped on export controls to control exports of food. In the case of China, both before COVID, during and after, there's been weaponization of trade related to other external factors, and then hitting supply chains because of that. And indeed, it's not just China. There have been technological embargoes, of course, by the US. So the whole US-China trade war in particular has increased these vulnerabilities, and these vulnerabilities have led to these new words that have been added to the English language: reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, whatever you want to call it. So I think that's one of the biggest trends, and of course that's led to the whole desire to diversify, which in some cases means diversify away from China, one of the largest suppliers. But there's another trend that I want to talk about as well, which I think is equally interesting, and that's in fact, it's reflected in the fact that we are sitting here talking about supply chains right now. And that's the emergence from the shadows of supply chains as an issue in itself, or as a collective issue. So, of course, over the last couple of decades, we've talked a lot about multilateral and bilateral trade agreements, and there are elements in these agreements that deal with supply chains. But it's not dealt with holistically. So if you'll just tolerate me for another minute or two. I mean, of course, trade agreements deal with market access, and they do deal with trade facilitation, customs clearances, standards, and so forth, some of the elements of supply chains, labor, SMEs, and so forth. But they tend not to deal with the whole picture. They don't touch infrastructure. And now we are seeing emerging a holistic approach to supply chains through such things as the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which has a supply chain pillar, which deals with critical response networks, early warnings for disruption, and so forth. The Australia, India, Japan Supply Chain Initiative, the fact that we're talking about it in this forum. So I think a really important trend is the emergence of this issue as a cross-cutting, coordinated issue that has to be dealt with, and perhaps will in future be dealt with through regional trade architecture, but is also being dealt with sui generis in discussions all around the region in various fora.
Thank you, Mr. Stephen Hughes. And we'll come back to you very soon. Next, I'd like to introduce Mr. Lee Makiyama, who's based in Brussels, and he is the Director of European Center for International Political Economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. You know, we economists say when taxi drivers give us stock tips, it's a sure sign that the market's about to crash. And when they have opinions on geoeconomics, it's a sure sign that China has already won. And maybe I should start by saying that in the past 5 years, I mean, whether you look at the pandemic or the war in Ukraine or various foreign policy or external policy of mainland China, I think we can all agree that they are all hard existential threats, especially for us here in Taiwan. But the events themselves are not necessarily, oh my God, okay, yeah, right. They are not necessarily actually economic threats. None of them are economic events. The truth is, they only become economic issues because hard power can only be used for deterrence. And that means that we shift our focus to economic security, whether we are talking about trade sanctions or much more soft and passive aggressive forms like coercion, export controls. We have seen that the only effective means of limiting our adversaries' policy space is through economic means. And let's be honest, all powers define their interest in economic terms rather than values. If values really mattered, Taiwan would have more friends than mainland China at the moment. I want to be very, very clear on that. But we are to a new turning point. Europe, which actually lack a security component. We are not supposed to talk about security at all. Well, we have started to introduce new laws and that channel actually existing powers like data governance, foreign state-owned disciplines and foreign state-owned enterprises, export controls into a clear security objective. I think Japan has conducted its G7 presidency extremely well, in addition to enacting its Economic Security Promotions Act, which actually go extremely far into unprecedented areas on not just critical materials and critical infrastructure, but also limiting the access to patents in the public domain. And I think also if you look at the G7 countries, I think we can see very clear trends here, which is one is that the leaders have actually agreed to a unique standalone text, which we may come back to, but by and large, we have tried to respond to a crumbling multilateral system, and Europe, rightly, I think, is also worried about an excessive securitization of the trading system, which highly benefits United States and China, but not rule abiders like Taiwan and Europe, or Canada for that matter. And in addition, G7 is not a like-minded group. It is a like-minded group that is not like-minded at all. And most of all, it's mostly concerned about internal competition. And so far, de-risking has actually not amounted to a real result. What we are seeing here is largely a proliferation of industrial policy that stresses economic security objectives that actually encourage, as you said, reshoring. But we need to be clear that reshoring is not diversification, it's concentration. You don't diversify risk. Every example that we have seen on friendshoring has failed. It's either failed to abide by MFN, the WTO rules, or it has actually just resulted in reshoring in a different name. So what we are seeing is actually not diversification and fragmentation. Or balkanization. What we are seeing clearly is renationalization of supply chain and deglobalization.
Thank you very much. And we'll come back to more on both a European perspective, as you said, of basically not talking about security and now securitizing every aspect. Next I'd like to introduce Deputy Director and co-founder of the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. Formerly, he was with the Royal Netherlands Army. May I introduce Mr. Michel Rademaker.
Thank you so much for being here and being invited. I'll take another stance at the start, actually, and that is a couple of years back, the Paris Agreement was signed with a lot of countries in the world. And our institute, as well as others, did quite some research on what it would entail to make that climate change adaptation and mitigation succeed, actually. And for that, the EU, for example, came out with all kind of policy measures like the Green Deal and others. But if you look closely at what that means, it means two things, and actually that's so. I'll use short terms for that. One is them we need to go from drilling to digging, and what that implies also that we should not use the word NIMBY anymore, not in my backyard. That was a starting point in their thinking, I think, about how could we create this climate change. And for that you need material, critical raw materials. And the EU actually already for 10 years or so on a 3-year basis states what they think are critical raw materials. And you need them not only for climate change, but also for digital transition. And it never hit the local population so much until Russia started the war against Ukraine, because there it was shown that Europe was very heavily depending on gas. And that was the first time that everybody, even the taxi drivers, understood that something had to change. And so now, I think it is in May this year, the EU brought out the Critical Raw Materials Act, and it shows in the analysis that we are heavily depending on critical raw materials. And they, as you all know here in the room, most of them come from China. The first signs of being misusing critical raw materials actually was at the end of 2010, when there was a conflict at the Senkaku Islands, where the first time the Chinese blocked export to Japan on rare earth and other elements, where Japan was heavily depending on for their car industries, supermagnet industries, and nuclear industries. And for me, I was researching that point in time already, critical raw materials was a clear sign that something was going to happen. And unfortunately, nowadays, we see this happen more and more. And I think the recent developments, and even, say, after, say, the export ban of ASML machines to China, the Chinese now are stopping, or at least limiting the exports of germanium and gallium to the rest of the world, which is another clear sign, in my view, of this is going to happen further, deeper and stronger.
Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to introduce Professor Yongjia Bae, who's at the Department of Political Science, Konkuk University in Seoul, and she's also National Security Advisor for the Republic of Korea. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lin. First of all, thank you for inviting me and having a chance to talk economic security issue from Korean perspective. Over the past decade, Korea's economic growth has been driven mainly by export. And this has been possible within the framework of international economic order based upon the free movement of goods, capital, and human resources across the border. US-China rivalry and the return of geopolitics, the scope of export and investment regulation is expanding, and the liberal economic order is in decline. Scholars call it deglobalization, or re-globalization, or slowbalization, whatever it is called. All these pose a great challenge to Korea's continued economic growth. We all know that economic interdependence has deepened with globalization, and the low cost and high efficiency of liberal economic order cannot be easily given up. So we need to look for a strategy to, balance out supply chain stability and also economic efficiency and low cost. So we are living in the age of so-called weaponized interdependence, and in this situation, economic security has emerged as one of the most important policy agenda. And I think the core of economic security strategy in many countries is, first of all, promotion, the strategic industry, and protection, their strategic asset, and building up cooperative network across the nation. So in the case of Korea, China has been the largest export market, and now export to China is decreasing very fast. So economic downturn continues, and the cost of doing business and living has been increasing. Korea, for a long time, has pursued a economic security cooperation with the United States on the one hand, and the economic cooperation with China on the other hand. But obviously, this strategy could no longer work. So Korea is facing with the great challenge of preparing a whole new national and economic strategy. So upgrading our innovation capability is one thing, and at the same time, we are trying to redefine and reset our relationship with the United States and China and the other countries. And we believe that even if export and investment regulation related to weapons and strategic items are unavoidable, more effort should be made to prevent those regulations from over-expanding to other non-strategic products. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bai. Next, Professor Jason Cao, who is a research fellow at Taiwan Institute of Economic Research.
Thank you. Well, I have only 3 minutes, so I want to use that 3 minutes to clarify one thing. So people always said Taiwan's economies are heavily dependent on China. That is because the exportation volume from Taiwan to China is account for 40% of total export of Taiwan. And this is a false claim because the claim was made like about 20 years ago between the politicians among Taiwan and China. According to my research, among those 40% of exportation from Taiwan to China, only roughly 4% was consumed inside of China. That means like 36% of exportation from Taiwan was to China, then reassemble, remake, then re-export to United States or to Europe. So this clarification is very important. So from now on, like our government should stop saying that our economy is heavily dependent on China, because our economy is heavily dependent on global supply chain. Because those 30% of exportation was to supply for the Taiwanese manufacturing in China. So after they make those products, they export to elsewhere. Okay, so if this point is clear, then we move to the question, the trend of the restructuring of the manufacturing chain. For what I think is this global supply chain depending on the demand of global consumers. So if the consumers wish to buy product from China, then those manufacturing in the global supply chain, they won't move. They will stay in China indefinitely because they always have a profit. But if the global supply chain start to move, then the supply chain start to focus on human rights and labor rights, and start to focus on the ESG of the global supply chain. Then we start to make a new supply chain. The global society might abandon the old supply chain. Utilizing this new technology, new methodology, even AI, okay? Or like we say, Industrial 4.0, then we start to make a new supply chain. Maybe we say the reshoring, or we probably building the new production base elsewhere except China. Okay, that's my answer.
Well, Professor Cao, maybe it's completely fine for you to continue, since I'm going to start with you for the next round of question. And from what you just said, you're starting to talk about made in China for China as separate from all the things that Taiwan exports. It's perfectly a good segue to my next question, which builds on what you were saying. So as geopolitical tension rises in the Taiwan Strait, why is Taiwan's economic security important to the world? And could you elaborate?
Okay, I think I'm going to skip the semiconductor issue because everybody knows. So I don't need to answer that. Well, semiconductor is very important, and roughly 60% of the most advanced semiconductor chips is being made in Taiwan by TSMC. But I think beside that, Taiwan is a situation, I think the geopolitical location is, we were situated in the world's most busiest shipping lane, okay? So according to data, roughly like 80% of the cargoes passing through the Taiwan Strait, okay? Let's make the, Taiwan's and the world supply chain so sensitive. So let's move to next answer is why the increasing of the economic coercion from China. That's because China even made a policy statement. They want to make the Taiwan Strait as their internal ocean. That means nobody else could pass through the Taiwan Strait with Chinese sanction, right? So that makes Taiwan important. And following that, as I said in the previous answer, 36% of Taiwan's export is for supplying the global supply chain. Means Taiwan's fate is tied, Taiwan's economic fate, okay, is tied with global supply chain. So that's why Taiwan's economic security is so important as a global issue. That's my take.
Thank you, Professor Gao. And Professor Bai, maybe you could explain why is Taiwan's economic security important to South Korea?
I think Taiwan's economic security is important to the world and Korea for several reasons. First of all, Taiwan has been a significant player in global supply chain, particularly in electronics and semiconductor industry. So many transnational companies, including Korean company, rely on Taiwanese firm for their crucial components and manufacturing services. So disruption to Taiwan's economy could lead to shortages and impact production worldwide. And Taiwan is also a major trading partner for Korea. Taiwan ranks the 6th in terms of trade volume among all trading countries in Korea. So its economic stability and growth is crucial to the continuous development of Korean economy. Also, Taiwan's status is a very sensitive geopolitical issue, particularly with its relationship with China. So any instability in Taiwan's economy could impact regional, East Asian and international politics, potentially leading to tensions and conflict. So a stable and secure Taiwan could help maintain peaceful relations with neighboring companies, including Korea, and reduce the potential for geopolitical tensions. So Taiwan's economic prosperity fosters stability in the Asian Pacific region. So I think in Taiwan, economic security serves a vital component of overall national security. So Taiwan's economic security is crucial for maintaining global and regional and Korean economic stability and technology advancement and regional peace. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Michelle, if I may, please.
Yes, I'm going to talk about semiconductors. If you look at, say, the next 20 or 15 or even 100 years into the future, one thing is for sure, that digitalization will progress anyway. And for that we need calculation capacity, which chips are delivering actually. And then on top of it we see AI, we see quantum computing popping up. So for sure that semiconductors play an important role in this whole development. That's one. The other thing is that if you look at the global ecosystem, I would call it, that is necessary to provide semiconductors, it's so complex that it's not one country or even one region alone that can produce it at this point. And with regard to your question, what it means for the Netherlands, we are, as is known in this room as well, that we are producing a super efficient, I think, wafer stepper technology from ASML. And for us, it is important that this value chain, this ecosystem, is not disrupted too much, because it's, for us, profitable, but it's also a key element in this ecosystem where everybody needs to take care of that we don't disrupt it too much. So in that sense, I think it's important that the tensions in this trade are being managed, let's say it like that, and that we constantly think about hedging it in all kind of ways.
Thank you. And Jose?
Well, I think it's clear that these developments we all described from stage have put Taiwan at the center stage, and which has also gained Taiwan many new friends, for which I am very, very grateful. But also, I think by looking at Russia's aggression against Ukraine as a precursor of how the West might actually respond to a possible invasion from mainland China, comes with many, many negative aspects. For one, many DC think tankers have confused the global markets and exaggerated the macro-political risks towards Taiwan's economy, and thereby depreciating Taiwan's assets and investor attractiveness. And many have also been fooled by these theatrics, and markets have thereby grossly overstated China's ability to project force overseas. Taiwan is more resilient than we think. And this has led to many negative impact on Taiwan's trading and security partners trying to move the production, in particular chips, out of Taiwan. And we know this is an exercise in economic futility. And through the absence of commercial logic, such endeavor seemed to, at least to me, very similar to the forced technology transfer that Beijing applies to Western companies. And I think here G7 countries must really stop looking at Taiwan as a problem. It is a solution. Look, especially when it comes to the dominance in the semiconductor industry by Taiwan, rather than actually looking at this concentration as a problem, we must start to see that we actually share the same interdependency problem as Taiwan does. And thereby, Taiwan's economic security problems are also our problems. And Taiwan's economic security strategy that has been extremely successful, actually, provides many of the answers that the G7 economies are struggling with today. So thereby, Taiwan's problems is not just our problems. And let's face it, if we shift towards a different parity across the Taiwan Strait, we will unravel much costlier and deeper structural problems than taking some flack from Beijing about signing a few trade agreements with Taiwan. That's actually doing trade agreements and deeper supply chain integration Taiwan is the less costlier way to go. And also, we are looking at coordinating our policies, especially on a multilateral level. We must provide a new framework after the WTO, post-MFN, that allows for economies like Taiwan to prosper despite the absence of MFN. And so far, I must say that the leading economies have been quite, let's say, disappointed. I'm quite disappointed. And in a world where economic security has de facto become national security, I think in a world where prohibitive physical confrontation is going to be too prohibitive, we must really look to Taiwan for answers. And that's where the real truth of G7 cooperation lies.
Well, thank you. I hope this panel will provide the answers that we're all looking for. Hugh?
Well, thank you. As you say, the panel has provided some good answers up until now, particularly on the semiconductor issue, so I don't have anything to add. Other than, of course, every economy has its own vulnerabilities. In the case of Canada, the largest manufacturing industries, of course, we're a largely resource-based economy, but automotive manufacturing, electronics, and aircraft are important. I think probably most people don't think of Canada as an automotive manufacturer, but the North American automotive industry is highly integrated. And of course, there's great vulnerabilities in that area, as we've seen with supply chain backups in that area. And so U.S. vulnerabilities are Canadian vulnerabilities, given the close integration of the two economies. But I want to move beyond semiconductor chips as an example of why tension in the Straits makes the global and national economies vulnerable. The President this morning talked about other areas of Taiwanese expertise: biotech, renewable energy, medical technology, and the whole innovation piece that comes with this economy, which is a powerful economy that certainly punches well above its weight for 23 million people. It's a very significant trader in terms of a bilateral relationship with Canada. It's our 5th largest trading partner in Asia, a potentially important source of investment in energy and critical minerals, where Canada can play a role with respect to supply chains as well. And so any disruption in this area will have a much broader impact. Because Taiwan is a dynamic economy in its own right, this will have any impact on it will have an impact on the whole region. And this is where we can talk about other areas where Taiwan can and should be brought into the international frameworks, and the CPTPP is probably the most likely candidate at the moment. There are obviously other potential channels, but the CPTPP would be an important step to demonstrate the importance of political stability in the immediate region, in the wider Indo-Pacific region, and for global trade. So I think that's an important factor as well.
Thank you, Hugh. As you note, our panel is really diverse in terms of background and expertise. So I think like to cap off with the last question, individual questions to each of the speakers. And if I could return to you, Hugh, to start. How does Canada's recently announced Indo-Pacific strategy deal with the issue of supply chain resilience? And how specifically will it affect the economic relations between Taiwan and Canada?
Yes, thank you. Well, everybody else seems to have an Indo-Pacific strategy, and various, success has many authors, and I think Japan probably was the author of Indo-Pacific, but it's had many iterations. So Canada finally has one as well. It was announced in November of last year. This particular strategy has 5 interlinked components: peace and security, trade and investment, people-to-people cooperation, sustainability, climate change, and finally, concrete measures to expand Canadian engagement and presence in the region. But an important element of the trade and investment pillar is supply chain resilience. I guess I could break this down into both a domestic and external components. So domestically, attention is focused on infrastructure. Obviously, infrastructure is an important physical part of supply chains, and so this will focus on West Coast ports, rail and road infrastructure, and overcoming the many geographical challenges that Canada faces. It's definitely a country, because of its size and geographical configuration, where there are these pinch points. Another domestic focus will be developing Canada as a reliable supplier of clean energy to the region. There are LNG terminals coming on stream on the West Coast in the next year or two, and this will be of interest to countries like Japan, Korea, and potentially Taiwan. Now, externally, with respect to supply chains, greater priority will be given to working with partners in the region, including greater Canadian involvement with regional initiatives such as APEC, and strengthening S&T and innovation cooperation with important partners, key economies. Again, Taiwan is in the forefront of this. Canada will, I mentioned already the CPTPP, Canada will continue to support CPTPP expansion for qualified economies. And now that the UK has been admitted, the question will be who's next and what the process will be. And I think the Canadian government has made statements that it will be based on qualification and readiness, and certainly Taiwan eminently qualifies in terms of meeting entry standards. We talked about diversification. Diversification is part of the strategy. You won't be surprised to understand that the diversification at the end of the day is perhaps diversification more away from China, but by diversifying away from somewhere, you diversify towards something. It's easy to say that governments can say you should diversify, but at the end of the day, it's businesses that do business. And so governments, through setting direction and putting in frameworks, can help diversification. It's easier said than done, but we do see that natural economic forces will lead to diversification. Part of the reason for diversifying away from China is frankly because of the vulnerabilities we talked about earlier, and also because of a decline in bilateral relations. This is something not just common to Canada, but was specifically driven by an event that some of you will be aware of, the detention of Meng Wanzhou, Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou in Canada on a US Department of Justice warrant, and Chinese retaliation by arresting 2 Canadian citizens who became known as the 2 Michaels. I mean, that was a precipitating event, a catalytic event, I guess, but that it was one amongst many that has led to a reevaluation of the relationship, and that in fact was part of the impetus towards reevaluating and reshaping the Canadian posture toward the region, which I think will have very positive, hopefully will have very positive impact on Canada-Taiwan relations.
Thank you, Hugh. And also, I think you have written extensively about Europe, the United States, and Japan. So would you assess for us Taiwan's supply chain diversification strategy in relation to these other regions and countries?
Well, I have to give it top marks, otherwise I would insult the host, would I? No, but it goes without saying that Taiwan has a long experience in de-risking interdependencies, while, of course, pursuing legitimate commercial interests. And that's perfectly fair. And I think that Taiwan has done extraordinarily well within its own policy space regarding supply chain resilience or protection of critical infrastructure. You have not been naive. And the new southbound policy and other major market strategies, I think, is very evident and obvious strategies in order to end the infamous over-reliance on mainland China. But we need to also remember that Taiwan has a much larger interdependency on mainland than the United States, Japan, or Germany. And yet, the decision seems so easy for you than people who are much less dependent on mainland China. It's astonishing, especially if you consider some European countries like Germany. But I want to raise the attention on one thing, which is that Taiwan's economic dependency and on its over-reliance on mainland over-specialization in IT is not a result of active policy choices. These are the only areas where Taiwanese business enjoys sizable market access. through ECFA and WTO agreement on IT. And these are the two agreements are actually quite problematic. And of course, Taiwan needs to diversify. But it's actually not Taiwan's fault. And if I look at a little bit of numbers here, 70% of all Taiwanese export go through these two agreements. And if I look compared to Germany, it's only 18%. So you understand how vulnerable Taiwan's export strategy is. And no country in the world has its fundamentals and economically depending on so few and arguably problematic agreements. So I welcome the US-Taiwan initiative for the 21st century, although its scope largely overlaps with IPEF. There is no market access for Taiwan in that text. And EU must at least try to keep even steps with the US Taiwan initiative. And what I see here when it comes to Europe is it is effectively confined to a Finlandization of its trade policy, where it has actually signed off to mainland China, who it can do free trade agreements with in East Asia. And that's a very scary outcome. I think Taiwan's economic security, therefore, starts by strengthening supply chain integration with the larger economies, and which will require actual market access. We heard about investment treaties before, but the real truth is if we want to diversify and we are really talking about supply chains, we have a duty to provide open, free market access to Taiwanese business so it can prosper. And especially given that Taiwan lacks access to intergovernmental standards setting bodies like ECE or ITU and FAO, here I really call on my European friends to do something. Taiwan is also excluded from multilateral lending facilities like IMF, so Taiwan has considerable share of its domestic capital locked up in very unproductive savings with a gross savings rate over 40%. And even by Asian standards, this is way, way too high. And here I believe that more efficient underwriting of Taiwanese public finances will allow Taiwan to spend that money on more efficient means, including defending its borders if it needs to, so that we don't have to do it for you one day. So just a hint, there are always second-order effects of everything we do.
Thank you. Now, that's a very provocative speech with many keywords that people in Taiwan talk about a lot: Finlandization, ECFA, and unusual. Although you're a trade law expert, you're probably surprised on this little island. I think everyone thinks they know a lot about trade law, unlike other places where they oppose it, but they don't really understand it. So I appreciate that. As we go to the next speaker, Michelle, I congratulate the Hague Center for coming out with really a wonderful study on the supply chain, the nuance of it, and I look forward to your sharing what kind of strategic planning and international collaboration are needed to address geopolitical risks.
Well, I think it starts with realistic ambitions, and those ambitions, of course, are shaped by, well, the US-Chinese competition, that's for one. The other one I already mentioned, it's climate change. We have to do something about it. It's not a business case. It's a value case in the end, because if we don't, then, for example, the Netherlands will drown. We're already living at 1.8 meters below sea level, so we have to do something against that. And the other one, that's the combination, is an ambition which is in digital transition. I already mentioned that. So giving these circumstances, the EU has formulated three ambitions, and from those you can derive your strategic plans. So one is climate change reduction, digitalization, and transition towards new economies in that sense, and strategic autonomy, which is basically focusing on elements that are mentioned here already, like diversification, de-risking, strengthening supply chains, etc. And if we look at that picture already, you see that without even actively planning as governments, companies are already doing that. For example, if you see Intel already investing a lot in new plants in Israel, in the US, in Germany, and I would call it a form of hedging already. And what you will see by those kind of big investments, that supply chains will follow and be redirected through businesses actually, following, well, business cases. And if you look from that perspective, I think it's important to, again, understand that these complex ecosystems, it's not just single lines of communication, but it's ecosystems, they depend on a lot of contributing countries. And that means that for the Netherlands, for Europe, but also for Taiwan, it is important to have a lot of different collaboration with all kind of like-minded countries as much as possible, because that diversification is the best way, I think, to boost resilience and to be adaptive to threats. And I would suggest that that is something to keep on developing. When we look at the EU, and I think it's already during the lunch being stated by the former Prime Minister of Estonia, is that the EU has brought out this Critical Raw Materials Act, where we have now a new ambition of having a 10% mining in Europe, 40% of processing capacity, and a 15% of recycling, which is first time, and I used in my first answer the word "not in my backyard," and that had to do with mining. And now I think the mental shift is taking place that in Europe we start mining again a bit, but only for these 10%. And that means that we are not there yet in getting less dependent on China alone. But so in general, collaboration with like-minded partners as much as possible through all the ecosystems is the best way to go ahead, I think.
Thank you, Michel. Of course, we're reminded, are we like-minded? This is a good question. And I think for Taiwan, there's no closer private sector friend than ASML in the Netherlands. So now we move on to, of course, South Korea. There's no, on this economic journey of development, there's no closer companion and competitor than South Korea for us. So, Professor Bai, how can Taiwan and South Korea cooperate on enhancing semiconductor, or in general, technology supply chain resilience?
In the mid-1990s, when I was studying in the United States, the subject of Asian Four Dragon, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong, was very popular in the field of international political economy. Among them, Taiwan and Korea achieved economic development with different industry strategies and structures. Now, Korea and Taiwan has occupied a very important position in the semiconductor supply chains and are cooperating on semiconductor supply chain issues within the US-led so-called Chip 4. Now, countries are trying to promote and upgrade their own semiconductor industry while establishing a strategic cooperation network. So, South Korea's Samsung and Taiwan's TSMC invested large-scale investment in United States, and TSMC investing in Japan, and Samsung planning to establish an R&D center in Japan. Korea also strengthening cooperation with IMEC in Europe, and Taiwan planning to build a semiconductor foundry in Europe. So in the midst of such mutual cross-investment, cooperation between Korea and Taiwan is not so active as so far as it is expected. So it's amazing. 60% of Korea's import from Taiwan are semiconductor, and semiconductors account for like 30% of Korea's export to Taiwan. So despite this economic and industrial partnership, in reality, Korea and Taiwan are perceived mainly as competitor in the semiconductor industry. Samsung and TSMC are actually competing to secure state-of-art technology. Strictly speaking, I think Samsung and TSMC are different kind of companies, and both companies have their own strengths and weaknesses. I think it's very difficult for Samsung to surpass TSMC in the foundry business, even after securing the state-of-art foundry technology. Both Korea and Taiwan are major partners in the US-led semiconductor alliance and have economic structure dependent on China. And we have to get ahead before China catch up. So the challenges from China is one thing, and in addition, it is necessary to prepare for the risks posed by cooperation with United States. So South Korea and Taiwan face a common challenge, and we must make kind of desperate effort to maintain unrivaled edge in strategic industry. It is true that a competition between Taiwan and Korea is unavoidable. However, the two countries could find a space where they could cooperate. I have heard that the Samsung already assembling some flash memory modules in Taiwan, and the smartphone application processor is also using one designed by MediaTek, Taiwanese company, and driver IC is also being made by UMC, Taiwanese company. And we need to develop further the cooperation at the level of small and medium enterprises in Korea and Taiwan, making the semiconductor ecosystem of both countries more open and more solid. In the midst of the US-China rivalry, both countries must seek a way to lead the stable growth of semiconductor industry and continuous technology innovation through mutual cooperation as well as competition. We now see clearly some huge structural transformation in global political economic landscape. Korea and Taiwan is at a crossroad, I think. So both countries had better search a way to meet these challenges through cooperation and turn those challenges into an opportunity to leap forward once again. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bai. And Professor Cao, I would like to refine the question I was going to ask you by what I heard you just said. So I think you said that the supply chain is going to be restructured more based on values than price going forward. I hope that it's true, of course. Now, the question I like to ask is, so Taiwan, whether it's the private sector, the public sector, or civil society, are usually not seen as a leader, if you will, in global policy. And I like to ask you, what do you think Taiwan can do to enhance global resilience in this new, more value-driven supply chain, as you noted, and claim a leadership position?
Okay, this is a tough question. I couldn't speak for the industries as well, but I can share with you some reality that's happening in the among the restructuring of the supply chain. So you all know the weaponize of the trade by China. So they will be able to coerce targeting specific portion of the supply chain. Yeah, because CCPs, they know like in the global society, the like-minded democracy are moving the supply chain away from China. And, they move ahead of time. For example, most of the Taiwan's supply chain, I mean the labor-intensive supply chain are moving to Vietnam or Indonesia. But before they are moving, Chinese supply chains already got into Vietnam. So how can you avoid, the Chinese intervening the supply chain? It's very tough. So that especially the case for Taiwan. Like China always used the agricultural product as the weapon to coerce Taiwan's farmer. So they start buying some fruit and they force the farmer to go against the government in Taiwan. Okay, so that's the common practice, and they are starting to, not starting, they have the long history of weaponize those power exercising trade against the policy that's doing the supply chain restructuring. So that's the reality, and that's the answer to like if we consumer have to gear away from the low cost production rather than value. If we could consume those durable, not like plastic, like low cost manufacturing, maybe we have an opportunity to shift away from low cost manufacturing. Otherwise, those low cost manufacturing supply chain will always among those Chinese supply chain. That's one part. And to answer how can we stand against the coercion from China, the answer is lie to diversification of supply chain and collaboration among likely-minded countries. And I would say Taiwan would like to have help from all the countries like-minded. But the other side, Taiwan can help. Remember, right in the beginning of COVID-19, the world is shortage of face mask. In Taiwan, we assemble the production chain of a face mask within 3 weeks. Not only to produce enough of the mask for Taiwan, we also give out those masks to the country that need it. So that significance size, the Taiwan's ability to mobilize whatever supply chain is very powerful among the, I think, the whole supply chain. So I would say Taiwan should actively participate in the IPEF, although we are still not a member, but we should actively participate in IPEF, CTTPP, and international organization, and that call for help from all those like-minded countries. And I think the last point is education, because the restructuring of the supply chain gonna have a brain drain problem. So not only apply to Taiwan, but apply to all those like-minded countries. So how can we build brand network? For example, like Taiwanese people can work in Korea or work in Japan or even work in Australia. And we should re-establish the global supply chain. So what I mean diversification is like Taiwan should heavily invested in like-minded country, not go again to underdeveloped countries. There's a different differentiation of global supply chain.
Thank you. So Taiwan needs to be more value-based, not price-based. and appreciate that concluding remark from the panel. We have very limited time because we have a bonus question to the panelists at the end that I'm sure you'll like to hear. So if we could take a few questions from the floor, and I'll see if our panelists are interested in answering these questions. Do we have the mic? The runner? Yes. Are there any questions from the floor?
Okay, we have one over there. Please.
Could you identify yourself, please? Introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, my name is Ben Sando. I'm with Doublethink Lab, which is Taiwanese NGO. I'm just asking a question because people didn't jump in before me. I'm not an economist. My focus is on security, so I hope you guys will bear with me for my questions. But we are at a security dialogue, so I think I'm allowed to ask a question. So I'm just curious about economic coercion from the PRC. Just want to ask you if you have done research to analyze what kinds of coercion by the PRC are actually successful. Some analysts believe that this question is overhyped, that it's not as dangerous as it sounds. I think the incident of the PRC sanctioning some of its critical raw materials exports to Japan was mentioned. There aren't so many cases of China holding back its exports to other countries. More often it seems to focus on its imports from other countries. So I just want to ask you if you've done any research to really dive more into this problem. Is it something that we need to worry about?
Thank you very much. Next. There's one here.
Thank you. This is Sui Huang from the Center for Asia Pacific Resilience and Innovation. My question is, today the panel topic is talking about the global supply chain and security, but we do not have a panelist from the US. Yet the US is really having a really important role to play in reshaping the global, not only about the semiconductor supply chain, like the global supply chain and the security framework. So my question is, what kind of agency does Taiwan or the Asia Pacific countries besides the US have to work with the US and reshaping the US policy with like-minded countries and to shape the US policy in a desirable direction that can really benefit the resilience of the global supply chain that is not only makes sense in economic sense, but also with shared value. Thank you.
Thank you, Sui. Well, since he's a colleague of mine, I'm going to modify his question. But basically, is there agency for any other country, the Netherlands, Japan, South Korea, in restructuring the supply chain? Since U.S. is, of course, a price maker, if you will, in determining some of this diversification. Can I just ask each of the panelists to answer either of the two questions, whether you can point to specific economic success in Chinese coercion, and second is what Sui just asked. And 1 minute for each of you. Should we start with you?
Well, on the first question, the experience that I've had is that in fact Chinese weaponization has not been very successful. If I look at it from a bilateral perspective, the coercion tended to be to exert pressure on Canada through interruption of key exports. Now, Canada exports about 5% of its exports to China, but they're concentrated in a few sectors, mostly agricultural, and these are there are certain parts of Canada that are vulnerable to these interruptions. So during the downturn because of the Meng Wanzhou crisis, China put embargoes on some exports. One was canola seed grain, another was on pork. And it's interesting that on pork that was very soon lifted. Why? Because COTI, or the foot and mouth disease, hit China. China suddenly needed pork. Another example was the embargo they put on Australian coal because they were annoyed with the Australian government persisting in pursuing the origins of COVID, and the result was power blackouts in parts of China. And so therefore, they had to back down very quickly on that. And so my experience is that it has not been terribly successful. It has perhaps a short-term impact, but China itself has some vulnerabilities, so I think that probably is one limiting factor that needs to be taken into account.
Thank you.
I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here. Hillary Clinton said very famously 10 years ago that economics now is in the heart of foreign policy and economic objectives are now the goal of foreign policy. China is basically embracing that playbook with a vigor of a very angry teenager and with that bluntness that comes with puberty. And I really want to play the devil's advocate on here, because you mentioned, for example, Australia. It was, of course, as a reaction to Australia's demand for a WHO investigation, rather than anything else Australia had done, and which led to the restriction on coal and wine. But also Australia has 25 or 30 anti-dumping measures already in place for decades against China. I don't think mainland China sees any difference, to be honest. They are playing it out and trying to see whether they can exert their interest. And with that said, I believe we do need an anti-coercion instrument, whether it is successful or not. I mean, the success depends on what you deem as a final objective. If the objective is to win friends and persuade people to like them, no, then it's not very effective. But if the goal is to actually to show to your domestic stakeholders and constituents that the government is actually fighting for you, I must say that they are probably doing something, I'm not going to say right, but there's something they find necessary. In the same breath, I would say that anti-coercion is necessary because we don't have any other means to basically retaliate. Yes, we do have anti-dumping, we do have a number of trade remedies, but they are in a democracy like Taiwan or European Union, they are subject to checks and balances. In other words, we are coerced when we feel coerced. It's a purely subjective definition. And under those circumstances, extraordinary circumstances, we will need rather unique trade instruments that we didn't actually count on. On the redesign of the supply chain question, I mean, we do know exactly who we are talking about when it comes to countries of common concern. But I mentioned the internal competition amongst G7. We are like-minded, we are also commercial rivals. We compete in more products amongst G7 than actually with China, because we are at the same level of economic development and technology. United States and Europe would never doubt to take a major detour to stab each other in the back, if we can get away with it, as long as we remain elegant on the surface. In that breath, I would say IRA has become a much bigger headache than actually any of the trade distortions that mainland China has presented to the multilateral system, because mainland China is still a rule taker, whereas the United States a rule maker. And another consequence of this is if United States engage in massive subsidization on a preferential basis without national treatment, it poses a challenge because we can no longer fight Chinese trade distortions together. That's why one of the reasons I believe the multilateral system has definitely come to an end. There are two economies in the world that have basically acknowledged that the world of global value chain and MFN has come to an end. It's United States and China. Everyone else is trying to maintain a status quo that will never ever come back.
Thank you. We're fortunate not to have a US panelist to actually defend themselves, so we'll move on to the Netherlands.
Yeah, I'll stay back, look at critical raw materials at that level, and then I see that China actually had had in the past and still has quite a powerful tool. So around 2012, they bought the London Metal Exchange. Before that, they bought concessions and mining. Then they established the Belt and Road Initiative, basically trying to control logistic lines. And at the same time, they start moving up in manufacturing as well. And the reason that I mention it and start with the mines is actually that because they are in control of those parts, they were also able to keep other miners outside of China out of business, because the business case for those kind of mines were too expensive compared to the material you could buy from China. So, and I think that position is not changed yet. And that means that we need to get to value chains and not business cases anymore. It means also that we have to pay more, but we need to do to get less dependent on these manipulating forces.
More than anything else, I would like to focus on the prospect of Korea and Taiwan cooperation and emphasize the need for cooperation between both countries, because that's why that's the reason why I'm here. So personally, I have been interested in Korea-Taiwan's relations for the past 20 years. There's up and downs in the cooperation between two countries. Now, US-China rivalry and supply chain restructuring is truly a global great challenge to both countries, but I feel that they are making us to, increase cooperation, strengthen our relationship, and meet the challenges together. In fact, within Korea, discussions on cooperation with Taiwan have become more and more active right now. And we Koreans are refinding the strategic asset and importance of Taiwan with Koreans' prosperity and security. So right now, Taiwan's export to Korea and import from Korea increasing. And the two countries have many things in common, we have a common Confucian culture and democracy and market economy and advanced science and technology and military threat from outside. So at a time when United States and China are competing for their supremacy, I believe the cooperation between two countries can create tremendous synergy. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I gradually feeling that we are going back to a planned economy. Taiwan is a market economy because we just, transfer ourselves from planned economy about 30 years ago. So that's why we embrace the global supply chain. And the question comes out that how can we work with United States? What's the agencies? When US come to Taiwan, they directly go to TSMC to talk about the arrangement, bypass the government. Because government has no power to exercise over private sectors. They can advise, okay? They can have loan leniencies. But there is no such a strong policy to restrict the private sector can go to China or not to go to China. I think the final verdict is about value, human rights, and which side we should stand together, okay? So when we talk about agencies, well, in the past, it's the Bureau of Industrial Development, but they no longer have the authority to manipulate the whole supply chain. their sole responsibility is to encourage innovation among the supply chain, not giving the points, okay, or giving the authority. So that's partly answer your question. And about the coercion part, I have to agree with Lee Makiyama. We don't have enough of tool to retaliate or to fight back about the Chinese coercion. But the least we can do is to stand together. You know, when Australia got sanctioned, Taiwan just have a Australian wine hike. Everybody buy Australian wine at that time. So when the Louisiana got hit by China's coercion, Louisiana beer was so popular among Taiwan, you couldn't get hold of it. It's all sold out. And that's significance this, like we can all stand together and we can buy from each other and minimize, the damage made by China. Okay, so that's my last take.
Thank you. Well, that reminds me, my think tank invited Malcolm Turnbull to speak here, and he reminded, in Taipei, and he reminded everybody that Huawei sanctions started in Australia. So to answer a little bit, Mr. Huang's question, not all price is set in the United States. And I think that it's very important for us to feel that we also, as Ho-Suk says, I think like Europe, Asia Pacific has long considered itself an economic power, but does not want to focus too much on security for a variety of reasons, and now we're at the forefront of it. So I'd like to ask, starting from Dr. Cao, can you give everyone a bonus answer for this panel that can see the future better than the rest of us? Can you make one forecast about the global supply chain in the next 5 years that is inadequately anticipated, but needs to be understood, for which we must be prepared for? Just a quick answer, thank you.
My expertise is foresight, but it's very difficult to project any event beyond 3 years. But 5 years later, I will see, from my perspective, I will see a much of differences, like different part of supply chain being moved to different countries. For example, automobile, electric cars may move back to US and maybe move back to Japan or Germany. And different part, maybe pharmaceutical supply chain will probably move to Canada, probably, or maybe Mexico. So we will see a lot of diversifications, and that will call for global shipping to upgrade, because the complexity of moving components, product, or even shortage of labor, how can we cope with that? It's easier to see a global factory. So, all those pollutions, human rights movement, social movement happen in China. But after the movement of or restructuring of the global supply chain, we have to deal with the problem that we don't want. And I think, all the government have to take a real stand that you really want this.
Thank you, Professor Bai.
Yeah, I would say the existence of a dual structure of decoupling of cutting-edge strategic supply chain and a high degree of economic interdependence in other non-strategic supply chains. For sure, the U.S.-China rivalry will continue for the next 5 years. In particular, competition will intensify in various strategic technology sectors like semiconductor, artificial intelligence, quantum, and space, and green technology. So in the high-tech strategic technology sector, decoupling will clearly proceed, and US-led supply chain will be formed, across, including Canada, Mexico, while Chinese effort to localize a core technology will continue. So United States would continue to deter the rise of China even after the presidential election. But United States and China would carefully approach to each other and maintain communication channel in order to take care of their domestic economic difficulties and prevent the conflict from becoming full scale. So many countries strive to diversify trade and supply chain, and economic interdependence among countries will proceed at a distinct trend in non-strategic sector. I think the very important thing is we need to design a strategy to harmonize our national interest and the stability of international economic order. Okay, thank you.
I think that climate change actually will show a bigger force for transition than just diversifying away from China as such. You'll see that the whole world needs all kind of metals for this energy transition technologies. And you'll see that in combination with more focus on local for local and recycling. So I think that we will not ship less, but we will ship more raw materials than end products actually. That's my estimate.
Very interesting, thank you. Hosuk?
I don't like forecasts because they're always wrong. No, for two reasons. One is that forecasting usually leads to undervaluation of initiative. There's a reason why United States is in charge, because it has the initiative. It's the biggest asset in global governance. Number two, forecasting usually entail extrapolation. You think that the current trend just continues as it does. But if you look backwards, not least to Taiwan's own history, we see that history has moved in zigzags. One of my favorite songs is by David Byrne, which said, "God draws straight lines through crooked lines." And I think that's really true. And if you look at the essence of policy planning, it's a function of preemption, preparedness, and expanding your policy space. Three very important pieces. And I think, if I'm going to be very frank, I'm not so worried about future Taiwan, because I know that Taiwan is prepared. I also know other economies and global player, emerging actors like Beijing, is also very, very prepared. I'm more concerned actually about some of the European capitals in my own backyard. And also, actually I'm going to go a little bit off script here and say that there's another reason I'm not concerned about future of Taiwan, because I'm going to add another people. You have some of the best policy planners in the world. I'm very happy to see that many of them are also women. Unfortunately, Madam Grace Chang has left the room, which is a recent acquaintance, but also there are many young people like Judith in the back. And I'm and not to mention yourself, I mean Cheryl, yourself is also a very important thought leader. And to embrace so many very important strategic women in these important places, I think is really important. And with that said, I'm not worried, because your national treasures is not in the National Palace Museum. They are working away on the Katagalan Boulevard late at night, at all times of day. And they're also working away for planning for your future out in your embassies around the world. And I hope you as a nation will appreciate their hard work.
Well, forecasts are definitely risky, but I'm going to make one anyway. And then that is that I think we have to assume that in the next 5 years or the near future that there will be another COVID-like event that will disrupt global supply chains. And it could be a pandemic, it could be climate change-induced interruption, extreme weather, something like that, as we've already seen this year with all the wildfires and floods. Or even a regional conflict like it's happened with Ukraine that's disrupted grain supplies. So what does that mean? I think it makes the supply chain resilience initiatives that I talked a bit about, and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is one example. Taiwan's not a part of that, but I understand there's basically a back-to-back bilateral US-Taiwan initiative that will do much the same thing. That makes these kinds of initiatives even more important, because we are going to have to develop disciplines to deal with the export controls, hoarding, ways of increasing supply, trade facilitation, and so on. And as I mentioned earlier, many of these are not covered, or at least some of these are not covered in trade agreements. If they are, they're in trade agreement silos. Others are not there. The infrastructure piece is not there. So I think that the work that is just beginning now, looking at supply chain issues in a holistic way, is going to be extremely important to prepare for the next supply chain shock. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we're almost on time, so I'm very proud of that because we had a very, very rich discussion, and I want to thank all of the speakers here for the valuable insights. At the beginning of this panel, I invited all of them to present their observation on the global supply chain and discuss what they believe to be the most important impact, and to go further into discussing Taiwan in this trend, highlighting why Taiwan's economic security is important for not only the region, not only for semiconductor, but for the world on so many levels. And I think the perspectives from Ottawa, The Hague, Seoul, Taipei, and Brussels really have enriched our understanding of policy, and the need for cooperation, I think, is one of the most important common themes that we just discussed. This panel has given me more questions than answers, I think, fortunately, maybe unfortunately, but also there are more optimists on this panel than myself. So I'm very pleased about that. I hear Ho-Suk said 3 times, "I'm not worried," and I thought, wow, please tell the world, because everyone around me seems to be very worried in Seoul and in Taipei. And I am pleased to say the questions I have are bigger questions, such as whose playbook are we following? Are values going to be more important than price? Can cooperation really lead to leadership in global supply chain? And the importance of Taiwan in a few years from now, will it still just be chips? Will it be value? Will it be the ideas that we generate here today at the forum? And I am so pleased to say that the ideas you have discussed here will stay with me and with everybody here in the room and online. I think amidst the international discourse on reducing supply chain risk and enhancing resilience, the experiences of Taiwanese businesses stand out as a valuable lesson, of course, for the world. As we said at the beginning, it's a double-edged sword, and I think today's panel discussed that as well. Taiwan's experiences underscore that measures such as sanctions and export controls may actually undermine regional and global economic resilience. This is particularly true when the countries proposing those measures fail to engage in sufficient communication and coordination without more discussion with relevant stakeholders in the region. And for that, I think all of you have made a contribution to take a flight all the way come here to engage in this discussion that we hope will improve global resilience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please give it up to Professor Lin and all our wonderful panelists today. Thank you so much. You may return to your seats.